I sat down with Professor Saskia Sassen, sociologist and expert in human migration.
I think that we have had many different phases in the history of migration. And for a very long time, the migrant was the person who was strong, willful, maybe an idealist, who went in search of a better life, leaving a home behind, a place to return to. The difference today is that there is also that element, the migrant, the refugee, but there is a deeper, darker story in the making, which is, for one, there is no place to go back. To keep on using the language of migration in this circumstance doesn't help. It's a quick shorthand, and it's a good word. But I think that we're seeing, in my reading, the beginning of a whole new phase that really has to do, one language I like to use is with a massive loss of habitat. They are not migrants in search of a better life. These are people in search of bare life, the bare essentials of life. There is so much despair, so much loss of options in some of these countries. And the United States had some role in that, by militarizing conflicts, the way they have handled the drug trade. So in the case of Central America, it's a desperate fleeing. And that is not a migrant. That is something else.
A lot of people know the terms neoliberalism and globalization, but how have these policies specifically exacerbated mass migration and eviscerated the economy over the last 30 years?
Economic interventions by powerful actors from all over the world, in particular countries, have eliminated survival options. We're talking very modest livelihoods, but they were real lives, So for instance, if you consider, this is for me a big issue in this whole story, that in the last 5 years, about 220 million hectares of land were bought, especially in Africa and in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, or acquired, is the proper language here, but they really were bought by about 15 governments and by about 100 firms. What happens when these actors acquire rural land? For starters, they evict all the smallholders, the small agricultural. These people are pretty poor and modest lives, but they had real lives. So they are thrown out. When they are thrown out, they also throw out sort of cultures of knowledge about how to make Earth have a long life, rather than killing it with pesticides and fertilizers. Secondly, they evict faunas and floras. A plantation means you go back to ground level, and then you deploy so many toxic elements that even those who are not affected directly feel that their land is poisoned, their water is poisoned by too many, chemicals. So it is an enormous shadow effect besides the thing itself.
And how have major financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF cemented these policies?
I do think that these restructuring programs actually have destroyed a lot of these local economies. And I've always been stunned by a fact that is rarely mentioned. If you look at what was happening in the 60s, especially Africa, when the colonial wars of independence succeed, and you have a whole new generation, brilliant people among them, really great people. Most of the foreign investment that then comes after the wars of independence and you establish an autonomous state, invested in manufacturing. Manufacturing is the one sector in our economies that produces a vast, prosperous working class and a vast middle class. Today, all of that is gone. Today, most of the investment is basically in land, in mining, in water grabs. That means that a lot of the wealth is sucked out, and it engenders a very rich elite that doesn't have to do anything to be rich. It just happens that they are the elite in a country that has a lot of natural resources. Now, in that whole story, there are these massive loans that were made to all these countries, loans that those countries could never have paid. The origins of that, again, something that is rarely mentioned, comes from OPEC. When OPEC, this goes back to the 70s, when this extraordinary event happens where the oil-producing countries make a cartel and suddenly raise the prices of oil, there was a vast amount of cash that goes to the oil-producing countries. Now, they could have chosen to put all that cash literally beneath their beds, and we would not have had all kinds of things that happened, but they didn't. They gave it to the big Western corporate banks. Now, a bank at that point, especially when finance was not as developed, a bank makes its money by selling the money. There was a surplus of cash, so they went and literally forced a lot of countries, also in Latin America, to take on these loans. And that is the beginning, really, of this extraordinary indebtedness. That indebtedness also makes for leaders, who they are like enslaved to this regime. I have all the figures, and they have spent more money on paying the debt than on education, on health. So that was, and then comes this predatory elite linked to the fact that you have natural wealth. It couldn't be a worse mix.